Hello, I'm Anne Miller and we're standing on the south field of Southill Solar Farm, which is a community-owned solar farm outside, just on the outskirts of Charlbury. Okay, back in about 2013, a group of very passionate low-carbon people in Charlbury decided that they would try and raise enough funding to make us as a town completely carbon zero in terms of our energy consumption. They put in plans originally to get 6 megawatts of electricity generated every year through solar power, and in the end, after a bit of toing and froing with the planners and the Cotswold Living Landscapes, we've ended up with landscaped into here a 4.5 megawatt solar farm, which is enough to provide all the energy for the town. We sell it into the grid, but it then provides not only energy for the town, but also, because it's a community-owned scheme, there's a certain percentage goes back to shareholders. Anyone could own shares who was in the town, but the rest goes back to a community fund which funds lots of different projects here as Sustainable Charlbury. The partnership came about because the original visionary folks from Charlbury spoke to the Cornbury estate, who were very supportive of the idea of having our own solar farm, and they worked together to develop the plans and get the planning permission together over a 2-year period, and eventually in 2016 planning permission was granted, and around September in 2016 they started constructing the panels you can see behind me, and by 2016 November we were generating power. But as part of that planning permission, the insistence was that the fields, which had previously all been covered with old arable crops, had to be replanted as a limestone grassland mix. Well, the site had 6 pairs of nesting skylarks across it before any of the work took place. So we wanted, as a community, to make sure that whatever else happened, we maintained habitat for the skylarks, and we had a very specific desire to make sure that we really enhanced the biodiversity here. It had been, like so many areas around here, almost a biological desert up until then. We've got 45 acres here, about 25 acres purely for biodiversity. So what we wanted to make sure was that we would really enhance pollinators and habitat for reptiles and amphibians. We've got lots of wonderful species here, like the Roman snail and a lot of different butterflies and so on. So we thought the potential to really enhance this further was really great. Hence the planting with all of the things that will become fabulous food plants for those pollinators. What we've planted here is a really classic limestone grassland mix with lots of things like the scabious, the knapweed, the wild carrot, the lady's bed straw, and lots of what's now just a brown husk, but a month ago this would have been yellow with yellow rattle, and the seeds are still falling out here. This has become an absolute feast of yellow rattle around here, so we're now able to share some of the seeds with others who are seeking to use it in their gardens or along the roadside verges or wherever. So anyway, we've planted up lots of original annuals in this. So the first year when it was planted, it was full of beautiful cornflowers and corn cockles, but of course as annuals we've lost most of those now, but the perennials have become well established, and the daisies are succeeded by the wild carrot, and you get waves of colour as the different flowers come out, and different pollinators are being then supported through the season. We did also plant up an area over the brow of the hill there, which we may get a chance to have a look at later, with a specific pollinator mix. That one was less successful because the soil type is different down there, and the weed burden in it has made it really quite difficult to maintain those pollinators, pollinating plants, whereas these, which are the indigenous ones, are doing much better. So the pollinator mix was something we tried out, but we don't need it anymore because, hey, we've got all of this. And then we also tried a bird seed mix, and the bird seed mix, the first year was again glorious for about 3 months, but when it came to the time that we wanted to see things through, the hungry gap from January onwards, the seeds had all gone, they'd all dropped. So we've tried several different mixes now with different varieties that Ian and Sam have worked with us to see what might work. But to be honest, we have a lot of pheasants, feral pheasants, that like to come in and take advantage of it, and lots of deer. And by and large, they take most of the things that we put there before we get to the hungry gap. So because we're not actually farmers here, we're using contract and volunteer support to do things. Repeatedly trying to sew it up with birdseed mix is becoming probably a less likely thing. We're trying to grow up the hedgerows instead so that we enhance the food sources for the birds. And of course, all of these wonderful seeds are going to be good for them too. It's interesting trying to grow things around the solar panels area here, because this area has been really nice and easy for us to cultivate. We could get going straight away after we finished construction, but around the panels, the land obviously had been very much more disturbed, and we then had to put a lot of seed onto disturbed land in a way that wasn't as easy to cultivate because you couldn't get in with the machinery. The seed didn't really take off that first year, and that became an ongoing problem for us because things like creeping thistle and lots of ragwort and so on readily took hold, and brambles under the solar panels. So that's been quite a challenge for us to try and keep on top of that and also encourage grass growth under there. We have now got well-established grass, but the first year, as with any farming enterprise, you're dependent on the weather, and that first year was not a good year for getting a lot of the grasses established. This lot got going really well because we were planting a lot of things that were deeper rooting, things like the chicory and so on that we used down further across the site, and the samfoin did really well. But the things over here, which were purely grass, really hard to get going that first couple of years. So I think if I was advising anybody now on doing something with putting in panels, I would say try and get your seeds in before you put the panels in, but that's easier said than done because a lot of machinery on that, but it would certainly have given a much more sporting chance things to get going. So this meadow, as you see it now, if I go back to 2015, was either a barley or I think it was a wheat crop across here, which then was just left the year that we were going to be going ahead with planning and building. So it really was just a lot of volunteer wheat until we cultivated the area. The whole site was basically sprayed off, which I have to say I wasn't very happy about, but you win some, you lose some. I understand the short-term pain for the longer-term gain here. So it was sprayed off and then cultivated and drilled with all of this mix early in the spring I think, from memory. So it got going during a good wettish spring, unlike the grass, which was going in slightly later and didn't get the benefit of that. On the other side of the hill, where we've, as I say, put in the mixture of the pollinator mixes and the bird seed mix, that's a much deeper, this is Cotswold Brash I'm standing on. Over there is what some people refer to some of the nicest soil in the county, a really deep, loamy clay soil, which is not really suitable for this mixture. Hence we decided we'd put some other bird seed type mixtures in there. And as I say, it's been quite a challenge for us to maintain, so we're now looking at running that more as a pasture, but we need to look again at what mix of seeds we might try to put in there. It might well be that we go with slightly more of a samphoin rich type mix for that one. So the management of all of this is the whole site. I should also have said that we did a lot of cultivation early on. Before we started putting all of these things in, we dug out about 5,000 thistles by hand across the two fields, because we didn't want to use pesticides repeatedly on here, so we thought, right, we'll dig out all the thistles. There were some really, really deep-rooted ones that had become very well established. We took all of those out as part of a community engagement project. We've had loads of volunteer work parties out here over the 5 years since, and done lots of work on this site. This area tends to be just left for the insects and the biodiversity until, and for the nesting skylarks, of which there are 3 pairs here, until about the end of August. And then we take off a hay crop normally. Last year we didn't, no growth, nothing worth doing. So this is actually the product of 2 years since it was last cut. What we're planning to do on this field, and certainly on the other one, which we manage slightly differently, is to bring in some sheep to do mob grazing across in the longer term. We did the hay cut to establish everything and get, make sure that we were basically cutting and baling, because we didn't want to get too much thatch around in here, but we weren't expecting that we were going to develop anything of high nutritional value at that point. But I think now it probably is an interesting mix for the sheep to enjoy. But I'm not a farmer. Looking across the site now, you can see how amazingly white and yellow it is, because at this point we've got masses and masses of wild carrot. Wild carrot has done really well here, which of course is great for pollinators, and loads and loads of bird's foot trefoil, which has done really well. If we come here a month ago, it would have been less white and more purple, because all of the knapweed, which has done really well, and the scabious, but knapweed particularly seems to have loved this site. And of course the whole thing has been just a showcase really for yellow rattle earlier in the season. So yeah, there are quite a few, you can see as you look across, quite a diversity of other things in there, the pink flowers of the samphoin and so on, and there were quite a few things like red and white campion, which have done okay, but they've tended to decrease in amount as these others have taken over. So we're very interested in seeing how this community develops over time, because it's still stabilising itself, is my impression. And once it sort of gets into a steady state, which I think it's starting to do now, because the first year, as I say, we had lots of annuals. The second year it was like one great big daisy field. But the daisies have moderated slightly now, and it's every time I come out there's different things which have sort of taken off. I generally come out here about once a week to monitor things, and we're doing quite a lot of survey work, hoping to do more survey work in the future to look at all the pollinators and so on that are here. So hopefully we'll get a better picture of what's being supported. But to walk across here a few weeks ago, there were loads of marble whites and then meadow browns, and now we've got lots of peacocks and so on. So it's awash with butterflies. And I'd say if I were doing this again, I would put less yellow rattle in, because then I would actually get a few more grasses. It feels a little bit unbalanced now. I think I would also say to somebody, if they were looking at developing this similar acreage, to do what we've done and have a mix of different things going on. So round the margins, for example, we originally had a 6-metre margin of tusky grassland mix from Cotswold Seeds, and we've allowed that to come across into the field a bit more. That's been great because we tend to find quite a lot of invertebrates. Again, we leave that for every other year cut, so we get lots of invertebrates in there. So I would say having that sort of mix of things, and perhaps having some areas, again, as we've done, where we've just put grasses and allowed other things to come in naturally, and to experiment with different things to see what works best in that site. The one thing I would do differently is I wouldn't have bothered with the pollinator mix, quite honestly, because I think that was a lot of time and energy for no great advantage when we could just have been doing more of this. It was to satisfy the planners more than anything else. So the area around the solar panels is an interesting one, because what we've got is we've got areas, big areas, which are just plain grass, if you like. We only seeded it with grass originally because we were so desperate to get something established that second year. We just thought we'll use fine grasses that'll do well as drought resistant. But it took a while for them to get established. We then had to mow it off to encourage the tillering and so on. So that was much more than we'd anticipated originally in getting it established. Having done that, what we've found a challenge is maintaining growth underneath the panels. Now, in my ideal world, I'd have had the panels up a bit higher and on a slightly more of an angle, because then I'd have had better grass growth underneath, and I'd have spaced them a bit more widely again, so I get better grass growth, and then be able to encourage more wildflowers in amongst there. However, we were constrained by the planning permission saying we had to keep it as low as possible, so the trade-off for that has been that we get more difficulty in keeping weeds out. And when I say weeds, what's the difference between a wildflower and a weed? A weed is simply a wildflower growing where you don't want it, but the wildflowers here are things like brambles. Brambles are lovely in the hedges or just here because that's great winter food for birds and pollinator food later in the season, but not good amongst solar panels because it's likely to grow up and grow over the solar panels. So for us there's a real tension with things like that, with ragwort and thistles. Again, some ragwort and thistles at the margins, fine, good for wildlife. Not good growing in amongst the panels because they actually come through and then create real problems. And the other really big difficulty for us has been hemlock. And hemlock's taken off all over the country this last year. I've noticed it wherever I've gone. I've seen it growing on roadsides and thinking, I'm glad people don't know what that is. But the hemlock that started growing up in amongst our panels here, we had to go in there and have another of our work parties to literally dig it all out and take it out. we've had to resort to using a bit of glyphosate on some of the woody perennials, so we've chopped them back where we've got things like elder coming up, because again we can't have elder bushes growing through the panels, so we've been treating those with cutting it all back and then treating the stumps with glyphosate. We're hoping soon that with it getting well established we'll be able to get grazing animals in there, as in sheep, and hopefully that will help to knock some of those problems on the head. But that's been our most problematic area, I would say, is that one. And the pollinator mix, largely because the pollinator mix had a big seed burden in the soil beforehand of things like bindweed. And anybody who has had any dealings with trying to get through bindweed, you realise why it's called that. It really is just such a pain. Now, once we get grazing animals in there, hopefully that bindweed problem will disappear. But in the early days of cultivation, it was really quite a difficult one for us. So what we put in underneath the panels and around were purely grass in the first instance, because we wanted to establish as dense a sward as we could on the brash. So we asked Cotswold Seeds to come up with an appropriate mix of grass for this type of brash, which they duly did. It took us a couple of years to get it well established. Now it is. What we want to be able to do is then go back and put in some of our own seeds from an old meadow that's at the other end of the site, and we'll be putting those in as we've done on another field on the site, just to mean that we've got a mixture of both the Cotswold seeds and some of the indigenous native flora as well.